No honorarium? Seriously.
Told you that.
I would have donated my honorarium to feed the children. Actually, feed the child, mine. But okay, hey, that's cool. That's all very cool. Yeah, I want to thank everybody for the invitation. This was great. Ruth, thank you for organizing everything, and Gordon University for hosting all of this, and Michael Stanley last night for really setting the bar way too high for this talk. So thank you for that. But a lot of thanks goes to Mark David Hall here for asking me out to do this talk. We had a little bit of correspondence back and forth. I don't even know if it was a phone call or anything, but Mark, sent me an email and said, hey, would you like to come out to Massachusetts for CPS and give a plenary talk? And I said, he says, no, Massachusetts will be great, it'll be fun. Come on out, you're going to be a plenary speaker. I said, okay, I did that. So I hung up the phone, and I was pretty excited about all this kind of thing. And the next thing I did was I went to dictionary.com to look up what plenary meant. Because I did not know. I told my wife, yeah, I'm going to be a plenary speaker. What's that? We didn't know. So I did a little search, not just dictionary.com. I looked far and wide, Google and all this stuff. I found three things that plenary speaker, or what a plenary session is. First of all, it's a required gathering. And I said, yes, finally people got to stay in the audience when I'm talking. So that's a good thing, right? That's a good one. The second one is a little bit out of the definition that you get for a plenary session, but there's a discussion about this, is that at these meetings and that. A plenary session is usually a summary discussion, often meant to convey received wisdom. And I thought that was kind of cool because it finally means that I'm an old man in academia. Because wisdom is nothing more than age-conquering stupidity. So here I am. So, and the other problem too, this was kind of nice for me, is because I always had this problem early on in my career where people would come up to me and they'd ask me my profession, and I'd say I'm a professor, and they say, oh, you're too young and handsome to be a professor. Not anymore. Here I am. So today's that day. And then the third definition, surprisingly, and this is fact. The third definition was plenary session, a method by which Mark David Hall uses to flatter somebody so as to get them to be an officer in CPS. That did not work. I said, oh, come on, you want to be an officer? No. You don't know my organizational skills, which are very poor. So I did that. So I didn't fall for Mark's flattery. You are all here, and we're going to have guards posted at the doors soon, so you cannot leave. So that leaves me just with that third definition of basically imparting received wisdom onto you. And so I had to sit down and think about that after I figured out what a plenary session was. I had to figure out, well, what do I want to talk about? I emailed back Mark and said, well, what do you want me to talk about? He says, anything you want to. And I said, great, ice cream, beer, and bacon. And he sent me an email back. He says, there was a typo, not anything you want to talk about, something related to your research. And so I went down to my wife and I said, most of my research around the house is ice cream, beer, and bacon. So he said, no, you're working on stuff on religious liberty. I said, oh, yeah, that stuff. You should talk about something on religious liberty. So it just so happens I have been working, my last book was on the origins of religious liberty. I'm working on stuff on religious property rights right now. A little bit of that will come out in this talk, and so I figured I would do that. However, I just don't want to talk about religious liberty. I want to talk about liberty in general. And talking about liberty writ large, I think, is very important for a number of reasons. First of all, because there's a tendency for us to isolate the study of religious liberty from all our other liberties, often forgetting the interconnectedness between our different liberties. This is one of my pet peeves. And it came out when I was at Princeton Theological Seminary last year with the Witherspoon Institute, invited me out to talk about religious liberty. And it's just religious liberty. And I came up and gave a speech. Folks, it's not just religious liberty, because you can't have religious liberty unless you have your other liberties. No, religious liberty. We compartmentalize it too much. We think that is our bailiwick, our preserve that we need to talk about. But if we're serious about that, we need to think broader about liberty. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and this gets to the title of the talk about teaching political liberty, because there was a back and forth about what the title actually was, and I never really communicated it effectively, so it ended up teaching. about liberty. But I think us as political scientists oftentimes forget to teach about liberty, in part out of intellectual hubris. And I'm going to make that clear a little bit later. And intellectual hubris is another one of my pet peeves, so I get to do that. And then third, since we're here at the Christians in Political Science gathering, and that I was on an earlier panel that talked about building the kingdom in a secular university, I had struggled with that one because I really thought the initial name of the panel was How to Not Get Fired at a Secular University While Being a Christian. But then Kimberly changed it to, no, we're building the kingdom. And I said, how do I do that? Okay, because that's a struggle. It's a struggle that I do have. And I think one of the ways that we can do this is by or through the promotion of liberty. And I will make that case for you today. Indeed, especially at secular universities that prohibit me from handing out snakes to be handled. They don't let me do that at our university. So they say, all you Christians like to hand me this. If you notice my bite marks, I'm just kidding. No, they're not really. I'm worried some there. All right. So that's what I want to talk about today. And I want to start off here with a little bit of audience participation, because we're late into a conference, and you all know what happens late into a conference, right? Everybody's getting sleepy, the pastries out there kind of hitting in you, and the coffee is not as strong as the budget wears thin, and so we need to get you active a little bit, and I got 4 questions for you, and I want you to kind of participate in there. How many of you out there have accepted Jesus Christ as your Savior? Let's see your hands. All right, that is good. How many of you did this of your own volition? Okay, that's good. Now, how many of you consider religious liberty, specifically the free exercise clause of the First Amendment, if we want to get specific and constitutional, how many of you consider religious liberty to be an important aspect of your ability to make your own choices about how you practice your faith? Okay. Here's my 4th question. How many of you are political theorists or philosophers? Okay, for those of you that just raised your hand, I'm going to ask you to hold your questions not until the end, but until Monday, because I will not understand what you are saying. My definition, my talk here on religious liberty is not going to be informed by Aquinas or Heidegger or any of these people, because I don't know what it's going to be. My influences are really different. I'm coming at this from a very different angle. In terms of this, I'm going to draw on some of I'm a political economist, kind of trained as an economist, and I'm going to draw upon the works of Hayek, Friedrich, not Selma, and Thomas Sowell, Father Chirico, who, by the way, I interviewed last week and will be on the Research on Religion podcast, where you can pick up these beautiful brochures after the talk. Father Chirico will be on Monday, so I'm picking up some insights on him, but also drawing a lot from my own redneck observations. Because if there's one comparative advantage that I have in academia, it's that I'm really stupid. And I am able to teach to a lot of people who are not the intellectual elite and reach out to a lot of students. And I consider that in part to be my mission. A lot of my faculty colleagues are very interested in finding the honor students and cultivating them. I get the rest of them. And I love working with the rest of them, because I don't think that they are necessarily any dumber than the honor students. It's just that people don't talk to them the way that they need to be talked to. And having grown up in a blue-collar redneck family, I consider that to be a blessing and one of my talents here. In fact, Kevin Cooney, on the way out, flying out here, I was asking about the service worships and if there's going to be any hymns. And Kevin had to remind me that the song Monday Morning Coming Down is not a traditional hymn. So, some of you got that. Other you looked that up on Google. So let's start by doing this. And I want to start off. I've been starting off the talk here for the last 10 minutes. But I want to continue with the talk here with a recent controversy. And again, I was struggling to figure out how to really pitch this talk and how to give it. But through a blessing, a controversy that erupted over the last few months or so, I did get a way to anchor this talk a little bit. And so I want to read to you by a statement or an op-ed piece written by Cardinal George in a periodical or something called the Catholic New World, which apparently is the newspaper for the Archdiocese of Chicago. And this statement is really going to illustrate the point that I'm trying to make here about our interconnectedness of different liberties and our intellectual hubris and our desire to only focus on one liberty and not others. Cardinal George writes, "Since 1919, the Catholic bishops of the United States have taught that universal access to basic health care is a component of the common good in a fair society. In the Church's teaching on social justice, concern for universal health care takes its place with concern that everyone have sufficient food and decent shelter and an opportunity for a job with a family wage. The Bishops' Conference, therefore, supported the goal of the health care reform bill that was passed a year ago, actually 2 years ago. It had many elements that contribute to extending health care for all. The provision that insurance companies cannot impose pre-existing conditions as a restriction of offering health insurance policies. The provision that sons and daughters can remain covered by their parents' insurance throughout their college years. Increased coverage of health benefits for mothers and their children. Wow, did that come around and bite them in the ass, huh? The cameraman just jumped up there a minute ago. You can't say that at Gordon. I just did. You can edit that out. Actually, Gordon students, they're good. They know those words. Anyways. Yeah, this is kind of a little bit surprising because here they are. Yes, we love the health care bill. Yes, more of it. We get the government involved. Get this mandate. We want that mandate. We want this mandate. What mandate is that? And then he finishes off in this paragraph. He says, but these and other benefits should not be bought at the expense of religious liberty and the freedom of conscience. Well, you can't necessarily have that all there. And it's interesting to think about this statement. The Catholic bishops had no problem imposing restrictions on others, including those individuals running insurance companies or employers that have to buy specific coverage for their employees when they may not be able to or want to. But when it came to what the Catholic bishops objected to, and this was the recent issue on contraception and sterilization and abortion-inducing drugs, then they cried, liberty, liberty, liberty. Now, a lot of good might have come through this exercise, and as you know, the bishops just put out a lawsuit. The University of Notre Dame and a few others have joined in on this, and I think this might be a very good intellectual exercise for them to have and for all of us to have as well, because I would say that it has awoken the bishops from their corporatist slumber and reinvigorated an awareness of ye olde principle of subsidiarity, which I just kind of learned about this the past couple years. I knew it was out there, but really started thinking about this kind of issue. Now, the bishops could have chosen just to opt for gaining an exemption for the contraception mandate and then let everybody else fend for themselves. But a recent pastoral letter written by an ad hoc committee for religious liberty from the U.S. Bishops' Conference also recognized that Catholic employees who are not directly affiliated with a Catholic organization such as Notre Dame or a diocese or something like that might also have exceptions to that policy, or want exemptions to that policy, objections to that policy. And so that was a very good realization, because it's so tempting to say, oh, we don't like that mandate. Could you exempt Notre Dame? Oh, we'll do that. Could you exempt the Archdiocese of New York? Oh, sure, we'll exempt that one. But what about the devout Catholic who is running a tool die factory with 70 employees, and he objects to it? Well, the bishops finally said, well, maybe that person has to be covered too. Maybe they don't want these kind of things here. Now, I should note also that in that pastoral letter, and we talked on the podcast once again with Philip Munoz from Notre Dame about this pastoral letter in specific, it wasn't only the healthcare mandate that was in that pastoral letter, but there were a lot of other things that the bishops started to be concerned about, such as issues of property and where they could build their parishes, which, by the way, is a very important issue just a few miles away from my house that they're having. They also talked about the issues of being able to offer sanctuary to immigrants coming into the country, that freedom. So there were a lot of other freedoms. It's not just the healthcare debate. So they are starting to see the bigger picture here. The bigger picture is not just religious liberty from one specific area, but it's liberties all around, our property rights, our liberty to own and do what we want with our property is a big issue for religious liberty as well. Now, I should note, because again, the bishop's statement says since 1919, the Catholic bishops of the United States, there has been this historical tendency to play things this way, not only among Catholics, okay, but among a lot of us, including academics, right? We want to support an ever larger and more expansive government, hoping that you will be able to get enough influence to gain specific exemptions from policies that you don't like. In political economy, we call this the process of rent seeking. Give me a specific thing so that I may benefit myself, because I'm important, and what I do is important. You might have the most noble intentions to do it. But it doesn't always work that way, as the Catholic bishops and many others are finding out. The larger and the more complex the government, the more difficult it is to gain those exemptions. And the more government officials, be they elected or appointed or through some kind of coup in a different country, right, can make you dance for what you want. That's the idea behind rent seeking. Somebody who has a big bag of resources that you want, or the policy levers to move things in a direction that would help you, can make you do a lot of different things. And if human nature is somewhat corrupt, not necessarily 100% corrupt, but, we're all sinners, there is a temptation for people to make you dance for the things that you might want, no matter how noble those goals might be. The cost of rent seeking, to put this in political economy terms, is directly proportional to the size of government. Now, I'm going to take a side step here for a minute, and I don't know if I'm off mic, but I want to go back to Amy Black's talk yesterday, and this was one of the questions I was going to ask, and I didn't have the opportunity to ask it. But Amy was worried about political rhetoric and the vitriol that has come about in our rhetoric recently. And we have to wonder, well, what can we do to do that? Well, here I'm going to propose a solution. Limit the size of what we're fighting for. Limit the stakes in politics, and that will help reduce the rhetoric. If you throw out a $1 trillion stimulus and say, everybody play nice, and talk about this nice, it ain't going to happen. $1 trillion is a lot, and people are going to yell, scream, kick, and fight really hard to get their cut of that money. That's the idea behind rent seeking. All right. Now let me look at this from a different angle. Kind of different connected thoughts here that I hope will somehow weave all together. Let's assume that my issue is religious liberty, and for a long time I'm very interested in religious liberty. And I really want to devote a lot of my efforts to promoting that, like the Catholic Church has done for the past 350 or more years. They have a very strong incentive to push for religious liberty here in the United States, and that is a noble goal. My good friends with the Witherspoon Institute and all others, Thomas Farr and Tim Shaw, who are working on these issues, I'm glad they're doing that. I'm glad they're making that their cause, and they're working a lot for that. And also assume that people like Thomas Farr and Timothy Shaw and myself and the Catholic bishops also have the best intentions for our fellow men. And they want to help them out as much as possible. Very, very noble goals, right? We don't want to see others suffer. We don't want to see others poor and broken. We want to go out and help. Now, since I have a limited amount of time and attention to help others, particularly since my issue has become the issue of religious liberty, what can I do? How can I help out? Well, one of the quick answers we usually come to is force others to do it. Government intervention seems like a quick way to help others, since the government can coerce people to cooperate and give up resources. Okay? It'd be really good if we helped to feed the poor, but I don't have time to do that, so why don't I get the government to do it for me? Sounds noble. Or another instance of this, there's a big controversy, and people were very surprised that I was against this, but Bush's faith-based initiative. I had a great deal of reservations for this, because the idea was, well, first of all, it did some nice things. It made religious charities kind of play in a level playing field with secular institutions. Yeah, that's great. But what it did is it opened up government grants to a lot of these religious institutions. I said, well, that sounds great, because now we can take money that has been taxed from the population, and these religious charities can take this. And I worried about that. I said, well, yeah, that's real easy for you, but what happens to these charities? What are they going to do? They're going to start looking at government bureaucrats for that funding and figure out what they want, instead of making the case to their parishioners, to their flock, to their constituents, saying this is why we need it. And for those of you who ever had to write a grant to the NSF, it's not so much about your research, but it's trying to figure out what your research means to that group. National Science Foundation. It starts to chisel away at what you do. Starts to chisel away at the soul of charity, I would argue. So here's the bigger problem, or another big problem, I should say, is that the bigger the government, and again, the Catholic bishops and many others, many of us have argued for a bigger government to help people, the most noble of intentions. We want to do it to provide greater welfare, assistance for individuals. Noble goals. But the bigger that the government is, the more expansive its roles are, the more resources it will need to accomplish that task. The problem is really augmented by the fact that a government bureaucracy that specializes in solving problems will need to disband if that problem is ever solved, and this means laying off its workforce. We oftentimes call out for the government to do something, but the people who do that something never go away after that something is done. In fact, they might not even have an incentive to do the thing as it occurs, because they have a stake in it. It's become their livelihood. If they solve the problem, they go away too, and that's a problem for them. In many ways, and this is somewhat of an irony that I see in our profession, sitting around lunch tables, talking with colleagues and stuff, we all complain about university bureaucracies that created this initiative and that initiative, and it never goes away, and it chisels away at the funds that we have to run our different programs that we're always concerned about. We always complain about the university bureaucracy. But then 5 minutes later, we want to do the same thing in Washington, D.C. or Turtle Bay. Doesn't work in the university setting. I'm not sure how you're going to expand it much bigger than that. Now, the more resources that the government needs, the more it will have to take resources from the population via taxation, and this includes future taxation via debt financing, or via conscription, which is basically a tax on labor. It's a conscription and taxation, same thing. And now by conscription, many of you are probably thinking, oh, military conscription, the draft, okay. But I'm also talking about other things that have been bantied about by some of my colleagues and others about creating a national service corps that is either mandatory for kids when they graduate from high school. You know, they got to go out and do some public service. Oh, wouldn't that be good if we had a program like that they were required to do, or alternatively, incentivized to do. You can't get a college loan until you do 2 years of service. And again, noble goals. Very noble goals. Government could do that if it wants. So we want more welfare, more provisions for our fellow human beings in our society. Let's get a bunch of 17 and 18-year-olds to help that. We'll take that labor from the economy and tell them, you go do this, you go do that, whatever the government might want from them. Now, I want to make this clear. The more the government taxes you, either in the form of direct financial taxation or of conscription of your labor, the less liberty you have. That's the bottom line here. You cannot do the things you want with your stuff and junk, including your labor, that you want to. And the need for more resources from the population and the greater levels of taxation that will be required for that larger government is going to have an impact on religious organizations and their liberty in two ways. First of all, there's something known as a crowd-out effect. And I refer to a good friend of mine, Dan Hungerman, at the University of Notre Dame, an economist, who has studied this pretty extensively, and I've done a little bit of work on it myself, is that the more resources that are taken by the government, the less resources there are available to religious organizations in society. And this indirectly affects the freedom of religious groups. Because a religious group might want to go and do something, do some kind of pastoral outreach in some way or another. But they need resources to do that. They need the volunteer labor or the financial resources of their parishioners, but their parishioners are increasingly giving more to the government. And Dan has shown that there is a significant crowd-out effect. Not only does the more that the government does in terms of welfare provision, but the more it taxes you, the less people give or engage in their church. And that's something to think about. Second, and this is not one that we oftentimes think about, but to the extent that we allow churches to be tax exempt, and we could have a debate whether or not that is a good thing. It usually comes up in the talks that I give. But to the extent that we allow churches to be tax exempt, and oh, by the way, churches are not really tax exempt, they're only partially tax exempt. A lot of people forget that. And or churches do not produce taxable revenue the way that other economic activities such as retail grocery stores or gas stations might. The government is going to make laws and regulations that favor the latter, those revenue-enhancing institutions and activities that produce taxable revenue, relative to the former, church organizations, especially during economic crisis. And this is what I'm currently working on my next book, that I have seen over the past 10, 15, 20 years an increasing tendency for local governments to put restrictions on churches because they're putting it in a comparative basis of what could be going on in the retail economy. I'll give you a good case for this. It's called the City of Cypress versus the Cottonwood Christian Fellowship. It involved, down in Southern California, Orange County, a church that had been saving its nickels and dimes for a very long time. They wanted to build a big, huge sanctuary, and they bought up little pieces and parcels of land at this very attractive site in the city of Cypress, California. And right about when it came time to put that first shovel in to dig their sanctuary, to build a nice big sanctuary that thousands of people would be coming through, City of Cypress stepped in, declared eminent domain, and says, we need to take this land, we'll compensate you, for another purpose, for the public good. You know what that purpose was? They were going to give it to Costco. Now, ostensibly, the reason was because building a very large church on there is only going to enhance traffic congestion on Sundays. Unlike Costco. Very transparent what was going on here is that Costco is going to generate a lot more revenue for the city on that 60 or 70 acre parcel of land than the church was going to. And in fact, this is really interesting because I want to bring to your attention a Supreme Court case that I think is very detrimental to religious liberty, one that affects religious liberty even more than that Smith v. Oregon case that oftentimes gets excited, because I have mixed feelings on that Smith v. Oregon case. But this one I don't. And actually, it's kind of interesting when you look at the parallels, because this court case, City of Cypress versus Cottonwood Christian Fellowship, I think was on its way to the Supreme Court to become the next case that I'm going to cite, until Costco, realizing there's publicity here, said, you know what, we'll help the Cottonwood folks move 5 miles down the road and we'll supply them with 10-gallon jugs of mayonnaise for the rest of their lives. But the court case that I'm referring to is Gill versus New London. And a lot of people don't know this court case. It's surprising me because it's one that really shook me to my bones, because it allows local governments, municipalities, states, whoever, to use the power of eminent domain upon the justification of we need more tax revenue. Previously, it used to be a road or a sewage treatment plant or something like that. But now it's just, well, you know, tax revenue provides public goods, so if we want to get more tax revenue and your church is not providing a lot of that tax revenue, so what? Janet Kilo, you have this ugly little pink house. We don't care if your family's lived there for generations. It's time to go. We need to give it to Pfizer because they'll generate more revenue, and oh, won't that be good for you? And this is important for churches because churches do not generate that much tax revenue. They do generate some, but not as much as a Costco or Fred Meyer or Piggly Wiggly, okay, for you folks in the South. And it's not so much that governments are going to threaten to take away a church, because that would be bad publicity, but they won't allow them to expand to new locations. And that's going to be a very invisible threat to religious liberty. It's not the stuff of you can't put the nativity scene on the city hall. I mean, honestly, I get a lot of my evangelical friends every December saying, oh, religious liberty is threatened because there's not a nativity on the city hall. I say, I don't care. I want a permit to cut down a tree in my yard. I don't want a nativity scene there. That's what I want the local government to do. But what they're going to be doing is increasingly, when it comes to zoning decisions and permitting for buildings or expansions of buildings, they say, yeah, churches, we've got other uses that we can use for that. And that's really big. And property. This brings up the issue of private property, which I consider to be very instrumental, very important, very connected to the issue of religious liberty. And the bishops in their pastoral letter also have been starting to recognize this fact. Because people with religious liberty, well, yes, religious liberty, but that private property liberty, that stuff, no, talk about that, but it does. It matters quite a bit. In fact, there's not only through this court case and what local governments can do in prohibiting churches from building and that. There's another thing, and this came out in my discussion with Reverend Shiriko. His most recent book, Defending the Free Market, had this brilliant quote. I had never thought about this before. This is why I love doing this podcast. It's not so much for your benefit, but I learned so much by doing it. And he had this quote in here that just made me really think my preference for private property rights in view of my Christian values. And he said this. He says, it so happens that private property demonstrates the interpenetration between our physical bodies and our capacity for transcendence. At first I didn't get what that meant, but then I highlighted it in yellow, better figure out what it does mean. I think it's important. And what's saying here is that, God gave me a set of talents, which as far as I can tell, pretty much include eating ice cream, drinking beer, and cooking bacon. Okay? And I probably have some other ones there, but, I'll figure those out eventually. But to the extent that a government takes away my choice about how I can use those talents and interact with property to bring those talents to their true fruition, and this includes through the issue of taxation, I cannot really fully realize what God has designed for me to do or what I can be as a person completely. That is powerful. Yes, people learn about God by doing things with the skills that God gave them. Wow, I never thought about that before. That is really powerful. And again, this connects back to that issue of crowd out. If the government increasingly expropriates some of my labor through taxation or conscription, I have less left to give my church, should I freely decide to do that. Now, some people might say, well, I don't want to give to my church. Let's force them to do that. Well, we don't. Do we want to make that choice for them? And that's a question I'm going to be challenging you with in a second. Because again, and here's an important realization that I learned through reading that passage, is that through government action, we can achieve some of the outcomes that we seek through our charitable giving. We can help feed the naked and clothe the hungry. Just want to see if you're paying attention. We could do that in outcomes through government interaction, but it chips away at the soul of charity. So there's a difference between the outcomes, which we might be able to achieve, and I'm going to hold efficiency aside. We won't even get in that debate. But the soul of charity, our ability to realize our charitable actions by doing it of our own volition, making those choices ourselves, which so many of you raised your hand when you said you chose Jesus Christ as your Savior. Let's let people realize their God-given talents through their own volition. Sometimes they may not choose to, but maybe as Christians we need to foster that, but not necessarily through coercive means. And let me give you an example of this. And this is where I pull from Thomas Sowell, and I love this example. I use this with my students all the time. Imagine you see a homeless man on the street, and he's cold and he's shivering, and you have a jacket, and you feel for that man, as I do and many other people would. We have empathy. We have sympathy in our souls. God gave us that. And so I give my jacket to the homeless man. I cover him up. Maybe lead him off to some shelter somewhere. Help him out. That's an act of Christian charity. That is beautiful. Now let's assume something else. We're walking down the street. We see this homeless man. I have a jacket on, but another man is walking down the street too, and he has a warmer jacket. It looks very much nicer, and he looks pretty wealthy, dressed very well. And you say, I bet that man doesn't need his jacket. So you pull out your Smith & Wesson .40 caliber, and you say, hey, Give that man your jacket. Outcome's the same. Homeless man is one. That guy was really rich. He really didn't need that, I know, because he looked rich. Is that Christian charity? Oh, Professor Gill, that's extreme. That doesn't happen here. Okay, let me give you another example. We're walking down the street with 4 of my friends. So there's 5 of us here. And we see a homeless man shivering and cold. And we stop and we say amongst the 5 of us, well, that guy's cold and shivering. We should do something about it. Let's have a vote. Bill, you got a really nice jacket, and you probably don't need that. So everybody in favor of Bill deciding to give up his jacket, raise your hands. Oh, 4-1. Sorry, Bill. And if Bill rejects, then we pull out the Smith & Wesson again. That's kind of how a government works. Democracy kind of works in many ways like that. And we sometimes say, well, we're doing this through the democratic process, and we're making decisions about who should be giving up what and where and when. So it's okay if we think that other people could give up other stuff, and we don't, and we just say this is our Christian charity. We're going to make somebody who we think has too much give up their stuff for somebody else. But can we make that decision? We do all the time. We do all the time. Now, I know that some people are going to say that I may be going to the extreme, and they might ask me in the question and answer period of whether I am against all taxation or all government regulation. Yeah, pretty much so. So deal with it. But my more subtle answer really is that this really isn't a dichotomous choice, right? It's one of degree. And I would argue it's one that we need to push toward the end of the spectrum, toward religious liberty that allows for the greatest amount of freedom possible while still providing the most basic of public goods. And that's a hard, where is that? Somebody will ask me, I don't know. But I know that freedom, like our Christian faith, is not an outcome, but a process, a journey, that we are constantly exploring and finding ways to do this. And then we have a goal, we have an objective for a free society, we want to work toward that, just like we have a goal to work toward being a better Christian on a daily basis. For me, it is a daily, hourly struggle. Well, it's going to be the same thing with freedom. It's not something we're going to arrive at, but it's something that we always must strive for, and we only can strive for it if we're aware of what is going on. So that's my case for liberty in a nutshell. There are other reasons to support liberty, and again, you theorists can all do that. But the other main point here is that our ability to freely choose our faith and freely act upon our faith, when we raised our hands and said, we do that, and to realize our own God-given potential is really based not just upon the right of religious liberty, but upon all our other liberties. That's the bottom line here. It is the right to private property. It is the right to assemble. And assembly means having private property. Because, well, you can assemble anywhere you want. Oh, but not there because you don't own that. You can't be on that land. You can't be on that government land. Sorry, Boy Scouts. That park is not for you. You cannot assemble there. It's also the right to free speech. And earlier in one of the panels we were debating about whether or not some of these court cases, some of these lawyers defending religious liberty cases should have been putting their chips onto this free speech argument instead of looking at religious liberty as a right unto, or religious freedom as a right unto itself. My answer was, man, you bring out the shotgun for this one, because you got to talk about every single right. That's not just one; it's all of them, folks, including the right to free speech. And by the way, I point this out to people, and it's a big thing when all my different colleagues who deal with the religious liberty stuff, they just stop at those 2 clauses in the First Amendment without realizing that there are semicolons, they're not periods. All those things in the First Amendment are related to one another. Our right to freely assemble is related to our right of free exercise. Founding fathers, I think, knew this. Mark would know better, but you can ask him. It's also the right to unreasonable search and seizure, which for me is to avoid excessive taxation and regulation. is an important one for me, and we can discuss whether that really means that or not. Again, might as well, since we're going down the Bill of Rights, it also means the right to bear arms. And you're going, what? Now, I just want to remind you, folks, that in the history of Oliver Cromwell, who extended religious liberty to all Protestants in England at the time, prohibited Catholics from carrying arms. And you British folks, I still remember that. And of course, you can't forget the third part of the third amendment in the Bill of Rights there, which is the right not to have soldiers quartered in their house, because as soon as you bring a soldier in their house, they're going to eat your ice cream, drink your beer, and force you to cook bacon. I know, because my dad was in the military and he made me do that. He did that all the time. All right. So let's get to the other title of this thing, because I got to address the title of what Ruth gave me here for the title. And again, I'm blaming myself for not being a good communicator here. And the issue is here, why don't we, as a profession, as political scientists, teach enough about liberty? And so this gets into an indictment of my profession here. This is where if I haven't really gone into troubled waters at this point in time, this is where I'm really, really going to dive deep into it. Okay? Based upon my casual and perhaps biased observation from either where I sit and, the secular university in the part of the country where I happen to be, or just on how I view things in the world. Based on my observations over 18 years after graduate school and 7 years of being in graduate school, I've come to the conclusion that we do not teach nearly enough about liberty. We teach about government, we teach about politics. We don't teach about liberty too much. And indeed, we tend, and this is going to seem strange, but this is what really gets me shuddering. We tend to teach about the virtues of good government with a bias toward thinking that if we can just get the rules right, if we can just get the most virtuous people in office, and if we can just get the level of funding right, we can use government for the common good. We have that idea that we can craft good government in such a manner that it actually furthers our bias for big government. Because after all, if we can get government to be good, then bigger government must be better. And so we have this ideal that we can craft the perfect government. But as the motto of my church, or my new church is, we're a church for imperfect people. We are imperfect people. There are other reasons why we tend to favor big government, and this requires us to look in the mirror a little bit, and this is tough. So why else do we favor big government or teach about the virtues of government and good governance? Well, one, we feed from the trough of the government. Now, me, directly, I'm a public employee. So I get subsidized, funded by the taxpayers in my state. It's just really kind of odd that I'm giving this talk. Right? It should be a talk on more taxation, folks, right? But even those of you who are at private institutions, you know, maybe except for Grove City College, you receive government funding. But even those folks at Grove City College might be applying for grants to the NSF or something else like that. So it's really fun. We're very scared. All around the department, every 2 years when there's an amendment or a bill issued in Congress saying we're going to cut social science funding to the NSF, oh my gosh, people are crying in the halls. That's the worst thing that could happen. Just screw those poor people who need to be fed and housed and stuff. We need NSF money to study why those people are poor and hungry and why they need it. Another reason why we tend to prefer bigger government is because half of us are communists. Or here at CPS, we tend to call ourselves liberation theologians. It's my little dig there. But the other, and that's a little snarky comment that probably was not called for. Could you re-edit that out? You weren't wrong. Love my colleagues. The other thing is good intentions. We all have good intentions. We're good people. We're imperfect people. We're sinners. But we also have good intentions, right? And we have the good intentions that if we just can craft government, we can make it good. All right. I have to say that. I forgot to say this, but when I was saying that, when we thought that if we can make government good, then bigger is better, my analogy to that being, now that I'm in Massachusetts, is that one Dunkin' Donuts is really good, so 13 must be better. Not always the case. But here's the other last and important reason that we don't often think about when it comes to this, is that the issue of intellectual hubris, I mentioned earlier in the talk. We think that we have the know-with-all and the wherewithal to solve all problems. After all, sitting in this room, we have made it to graduate school, and from graduate school, we've made it into some very, very elite universities, doing very good things. We were the straight A students all along. And I have to point this out to my TAs and to other folks in the profession, is that we're at kind of one end of the curve. Remember how Stanley last night was talking about being on that right end of the tail? Now, I'm not at the right end of the tail that gets me $80 million a year, but I'm at another end of that tail. That people throughout my life has told me, you're really smart, you're really smart, you're really smart. Of course I'm really smart. I can solve everybody else's problem for them. Because I know. And if only people could live like me because I got it right. Look at my transcript. That is why I feel so blessed with the gift of stupid. Right? Coming from the background I have is, I'm going to relish in that. And I tell my honor students and straight A students, so many of my colleagues, we love them, we embrace them. I get scared for them. Because we never point out what their limitations are. And that breeds that intellectual hubris. The best thing you can do for a straight A student is give them a C. See what it's like. Not to be perfect. Not to know everything. God birthed us with limited knowledge and with different talents. That's who we are, folks. We don't know everything. We have different talents. Some people have talents of being carpenters, and it's beautiful. And I have, my colleagues are saying, well, if you don't do well in college, you're going to have to build cabinets. So what? I like people who build cabinets. Beautiful cabinets. And that's one of God's creation. Your hands are using to build something like that. You're finding your transcendence through that. That's okay. We have different talents. And students come to me and they think, I got a D in your class and you must not like me. No, I still love you. It's just I don't love you doing political science. And you should be glad that I'm telling you that, because you need to go build cabinets, because I need some in my house, and I bet they are beautiful cabinets. Right? And this is where I bring in Hayek, one of my favorite economists. The observation that we have all very, 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 very limited knowledge. Even the smartest person in the world only has the teeny tiniest, microscopic amount of knowledge about how other things should work. Yet, nonetheless, a lot of us think that we can make policy for somebody who's doing something in Boise, Idaho. Do we know anything about that person? Wouldn't it be better if that person, if we allowed individuals to freely realize their own decisions as so as to respect God's design for that individual? That's where all this stuff connects for me. That's where all this stuff really connects to me. And it's difficult because you know what it means? It means trusting the knowledge of others and trusting that they will do well with the freedom that God grants them. And I know this because I have a debate, ongoing debate. We have a Theology on Tap group that meets in bars, which is one of the reasons we got kicked out of our denomination. And I sit down there, there's this guy who is always there, and we always kind of debate politics and stuff. And he said something really revealing to me one time. We were talking about this issue of freedom. He says, I love freedom. I absolutely love freedom. He says, and I want we're talking about regulations. He says, I want less regulations on me so that I can wire my house because I know about electrical wiring. The problem is the person next door to me doesn't know anything about that. That's why we need the regulations. Well, how do you know that? I asked him, how do you know that? You know that guy next door or down the street doesn't know anything about wiring? Or that he would say, hey, I don't know about wiring, so I'm going to go get somebody who does. No, he wanted to regulate that because he was worried about the knowledge of the other person. He didn't trust that they would do the right thing with that freedom. That's intellectual hubris. Think we're smarter than everybody else. We're not. And it's a tough choice to let go of that. Say other people, yeah, we need it. It comes down to us that God made human beings, human individuals, to amaze. And we can't let other people amaze us if we don't give them the freedom to do so. For me, that's very important. I'm going to finish up here with a little discussion about how do we teach freedom. I said why we need to teach freedom, but how do we need to teach freedom here? And for me, this has been a realization that's been growing over a number of years. And the first thing I think we need to do is a simple examination of what we're teaching. Okay? I asked myself, am I telling my students that good government can solve all of our problems and that if we have a good government, we can have a bigger government? Am I doing that? Am I really doing that? That's the one thing that I have to ask myself. And then the next thing is, do we really believe that? And I go back again to that instance where we're sitting around the university cafeteria and we complain about how messed up the university bureaucracy is, yet we go and lobby for more university bureaucracy. Is that what we're doing? Is that what we're doing in our classrooms? We need to do that. And then we need to think about, we can talk about crafting government and designing good government and how we get good people in there and make good decisions. I'm not against that. I think that's good. But we also need to teach about freedom. Are there ways that we can inject the lessons of freedom into our classes? And I've changed my classes over the year. I teach an introduction to political economy. And it used to be a survey of, Keynes and Marx and, Friedman and all those folks. But now I teach it as a course of central planning versus free markets and contrast that choice for students. Because most of them, having grown up in the family, which, by the way, is a socialist economy, centrally planned, don't have any clue about what a free market is. And when you get an 18-year-old that was moved from a central planned economy named mom and dad to college, they get freaked out by freedom. An economist named Dan Benjamin made that observation to me. I said, why aren't students getting this thing about freedom? It's because they've never experienced. They don't understand free markets because they've never been in one. Now they are, and it's kind of scary. It is scary. Freedom's scary, folks. There's no doubt about it. So I do that in my introduction to political economy. In my introduction to comparative politics course, I make it I used to teach, well, this is parliamentary systems, and this is presidential, and you can have the hybrid. And, boring. I just realized students like, or that. You know what? I'm going to tell a story. I'm going to tell you the history of freedom throughout the world. My anchor point is usually the Magna Carta, right? So this is modern world. This is kind of where everything began. And I talk about the struggles and the history of freedom, emphasizing that it is an ongoing struggle, that we've marched toward greater freedom throughout the world. But we've had setbacks, and we need to understand what that tension is. In my religion and upper division religion and politics class, instead of teaching about, well, what are Catholics thinking about abortion this week? Right? Most students come into my class saying, oh, you're going to talk about Catholics and abortion because it's religion and politics class. No. I say some Catholics don't like it, some do. I don't know why. You go figure that out. What I do instead is I talk about the issue of freedom and why that is important for churches so that they can realize the things that they want to, because they're just like entities like everybody else. They want freedom. They want to accomplish things. They want to do things in society. We also need to do an honest self-examination of our own souls. Do I really know what is best for society? Of course I do. Or do I? Do I know what that guy down the road can do with his house? Do I trust him enough to do that? Those are tough questions. And oftentimes for me, the answers are no, I don't trust people. I do want to regulate them. And then I have to sit and, what are the consequences of that? Catholic bishops say, we don't trust people to provide the free market to provide health care for people because that won't happen. So we need the government to regulate that. But all of a sudden, it comes back to us. That's the consequence of that. And that might not be too good. And again, am I better at solving a problem from somebody who's far away, or somebody at that local level better at doing it? That principle of subsidiarity. I'm really starting to embrace that idea now once I understood it. It's kind of a neat idea. The other thing we need to ask for ourselves, too, is are we breeding intellectual hubris or elitism into our students? And again, as I mentioned before, I really am scared for 4.0 students. And my son comes home from 6th grade and says, I got a B-. It's good. Really? Yeah, don't do it again, but you know, it's okay, because it's not the B-, it's how you recover. B- is actually pretty good according to my grades. You know, it's how you recover from enough. That's the true character of somebody. And I tell those students, you know, so I get students in my office, I'm a C student, you don't like me. Yes, if you're a C student working to be a B student, I love you because you're going to succeed in the world. You understand humility and what it takes to do that. And that's the message that we got to get. And that is a very liberating idea that really connects with freedom. If I can do it, other people can do it too. And we also need to celebrate and point out the triumphs of freedom in our classes. I don't think we do that too often. We need to look at what freedom has brought us historically. And this is a problem for us political scientists, because we're social scientists that tend to emphasize the here and the now, not the history of things. And there is a danger at looking at world problems, such as poverty, ahistorically, because we might quickly throw away everything that is working so well. My gosh, we have poverty in the streets of America today. It must be because the system that we have is failing us. Let's get rid of it. You know what? The option could be a lot worse. We need to put it in historical perspective. Poverty was really, really bad not too long ago. And really, really, really bad longer ago than that. We've made a lot of progress. And the issue with healthcare, to connect it back to what the bishops were talking about, this whole issue that we're in a healthcare crisis. I ask my students, one of the most important economic lessons I teach to them, ask the question, compared to what? We had a healthcare crisis in 2005, 2006. Actually, we're doing pretty good. They had a healthcare crisis in 1350. That was a healthcare crisis. That's the bubonic plague for you those keeping up. But it's amazing when you think in 2005 and 2006 that one of my good friends could get stents to clear out arteries at relatively little cost, which in the 1970s would have only been available to very few individuals. It's a good thing that he had that opportunity, and that has proceeded historically. So things always look bad in the present. You can always find ways of things looking bad, but you need to put it into a broader context here. All right, so that's it. That's my last thought there. My closing idea here is that we need to empower our students with the knowledge, and for some of you who are in Christian universities, that is really good. For me, in a secular institution, it's really difficult and burdensome on me. We need to empower our students with the knowledge that they are God's creatures. And with freedom, they will be able to achieve what God has planned for them. And we need to do that in a way that does not encourage too much vanity. I open it up to questions. How am I doing for time? Are we out of time for questions? Sorry, folks. Let's go.
No. You know, since I stole 10 minutes at time, why don't we go to maybe 12:20 or so? That would still give us 10 minutes before lunch.
Yeah.
Question back there?
Question back there. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thanks for the red meat. I appreciate it.
Okay.
It's always good to be reminded of the need for liberty.
Yeah, you're from Canada, right?
I'm from Canada.
The healthcare system. Sorry about that, but okay, go ahead. I know.
Well, if you want to go there, we can.
Okay. All right.
Well, our banking system's doing very well.
Okay. I'm
not sure about yours.
There you go.
Last time I checked, our deficit was in pretty good shape, too.
We're going to win the Stanley Cup this year.
Okay, sorry. Let's not do this. So yes, I mean, I want to applaud you and say thank you for, reminding us of the importance of liberty. I think something that has made both your country and my country great, and which continues to attract people from all over the world who have not experienced or seen the fruit of that. My question to you, though, is that if you are hoping to be persuasive, if you're hoping to persuade others of the need for this, for liberty, I wonder if the argument that you're using is an appropriate one, because what you simply suggest is that liberty must reign except at the margins. And you say, you know, that's economic language, but you say, except in those situations where you need to have basic goods, and then it may be appropriate for government to usurp the land to build a road or a military base or a police station or something of that sort. But I wonder if your focus on liberty will not simply, as you frame it right now, simply cause the majority of people to tune out, simply because they say, you know what, all this talk about liberty is well and good, but my mom is dying of cancer. She was not able to get this, and quite frankly, I don't want your talk about liberty. I want, and so that's thing number one. And I'm wondering if there's a strategy that might be a better one in terms of the persuasiveness of persuading people the importance of liberty, which is important. And that is to actually look deeper into the principle of subsidiarity from a Catholic perspective, or for differentiated responsibility from a Kuyperian perspective, and recognize that in order for liberties to be present, one must also provide an account for responsibilities, competencies, and jurisdictions, not only of individuals, but of institutions. And I'm wondering if perhaps you can speak to, I mean, your strategy is good. It's a red meat. We need to be free, except at the margins. But I'm wondering if that's going to be persuasive to an academic audience and to the person whose mother is dying of cancer.
A very good question. And you know, in some degree, I'm going to punt on this question. As I mentioned earlier in the talk, it's you mentioned it. I like liberty, except at the margins. That exception becomes difficult. You know, I'm not a pure anarchist. I'm not in any way, shape, or form. That's why I consider it to be a process. It's a struggle that we're always moving toward. And it is a tough sell. I make no illusions how difficult a sell it is, the idea of liberty. And I finally understood this after Dan Benjamin explained this to me, that, you know, your 18 and your 19 and your 20-year-olds that are in your class right now came from a very secure and planned economy for the most part. You know, there are exceptions, right? And so it is very difficult, because freedom is very scary. That you know, a person who has a mother dying of cancer, and that's a tough sell. So how do we sell it? Now, I think you're asking me to sit down with that child of the mother who's dying from cancer and to go through the issues of subsidiarity and competency and jurisdictions. It took me like 40 years to figure out what subsidiarity was, right? So maybe we could build a case on this, but from my vantage point, this is how I do it, right? I'm the dumb redneck and try to explain it the best I can to people. And to a religious audience, you know, when I go and give talks similar to this and how to sell it, God gave you a lot. Don't you want the freedom to live that out? Because you can do a lot more than you think you can, because God gave you a whole lot. Then I don't have to use the word competencies and jurisdictions. Not a good answer to your question. And I don't know how to sell it. But that's not what I was asked to. There's a question over here. Yes, ma'am.
As I'm listening to your talk, my portfolio includes...
you got to give your name for the camera.
Hi, I'm Mary.
Okay.
My portfolio includes terrorism and national security and disaster assistance management. That's what I teach. Yeah. And the question we play with in my class is, what are you willing to give up to be safe? And if you were to talk to my students about liberty, they'd say, we're willing to give up a lot. We're willing to have a, surveillance, and what we hear about a lot, basically is this idea of, domestic insurgency, things like that. People who will say, I'd rather have the government tell me what my church can and can't do because I'm worried about Sharia law. If the government says, churches can do whatever they want, the Muslim lady next door is going to homeschool her children and she's not going to teach her daughters to read, something like that.
I know.
How do you respond to
and
that?
And those Jehovah's Witnesses won't get their blood transfusions when they need them. I know. It's hard. It's a hard sell. Actually, I'm glad you raised this question, because it brings up a little example for me that goes back to the old Second Amendment, and I can trace everything back to that one. How much are we willing to give up? Recently in my county, King County, Washington, the sheriff, 3 or 4 years ago, said that they are not going to investigate any property crimes under $10,000 anymore. And I heard that, I said, you know what? There's going to be a spike in crime. And you know what? There was a spike in crime in our neighborhood. right? I mean, the police come out, they take the report, but they're just passing it off to the insurance company. So when somebody steals your lawn tractor, you just, hey, Allstate, please give me a new one here, okay? So I got a new Springfield. 40 caliber. You don't know the Springfield. What's a Springfield? Dishwasher? No. A little bit more powerful than that. And again, this is a trend. This is tough, right? Am I willing to get the full body cavity search not to be blown up on an airline and stuff? It's a tough sell, right? None of this is, I'm not so Pollyannish to think that I give this talk and say, hey, God gave you all these talents, let's be free. And people say, amen, let's do it. Because I know, including myself, everybody says, I love freedom except. And it's a daily struggle. It's like I get up every morning and I say, Jesus, I love you and I'm going to make you proud of me. Except. And that's the fight. That's how I reconcile this issue of liberty, because God gave me free will. Something to struggle with, just like God implanted me with the faith that I had. I don't know how to answer that. So, yeah, I'm going to go over here because that question, green shirt, and then we'll come back here, and then we'll go there, and then green shirt, yes, sir.
All right. I'm Sam Green from Howard Payne University in Texas. Okay. I'll start with a disclaimer. I am not a political theorist.
Yes. Okay.
All right. And now I'm going to raise a potential theological objection.
Oh, okay.
I've become a political theorist.
All right. I'm not too good in theology either, by the way. My pastor will tell you that. But you're a practicing Christian, that really we're going to put the emphasis on practice, son. Okay, go ahead.
But just given that we're at CPS, so if I understand correctly, your understanding of liberty is more or less my freedom to do, as a Christian, whatever the heck I want. I'll say heck, one swearing academic's enough for Gordon College.
Yeah, I come from this from a very political economy perspective on this, right? I view, and it's in my book, which, by the way, is available for sale outside, 10% off. If you buy it today, I will also autograph it and draw a farm animal in it if you want. But my definition of liberty is framed in terms of my economic way of thinking of things. The less regulations, the less restrictions I have to do. Now, go ahead and give me your theological question.
So the question is that consistent with the Christian's relationship with authority as explained in the New Testament?
Sure. I don't. The whole rendering unto Caesar thing kind of stuff?
It just seems that...
Which is, by the way, another good title for a book, which is on sale outside. Yeah, go ahead.
I guess I'm thinking that the relationship between the Christian and the government in Acts seems to be much more subservient, and then also the relationship between the follower of Yahweh in the Old Testament seems to be that the government has all sorts of very burdensome regulations in economics and otherwise.
Yeah, I'm just going to throw up my hands in terms of intellectual incompetency here. In terms of that, the Book of Acts is I think my favorite book in the Bible because it's a good story. It's a story about how things moved, right, from Jesus onwards. I love that story, right? But I'm not. I don't know what it says because I'm still trying to figure that out. But I know that when people say, "Well, shouldn't you be subservient to authority?" I say, it depends what authority wants me to do, and I have my limits. And I know that if I can, I guess my basis is that, listen, if you're going to restrict me from doing something really bad and doing something evil to somebody, well, yeah, maybe that's a good restriction. But if you're preventing me from doing something that I could do really good and amaze you and show you my talents that God gave me, step out of my way. That's my answer. And that's not influenced by Aquinas, Augustine, or Augustine. This is dumb old redneck coming out here. Right? I don't know, but I know it when I see it. Okay, there's a question over here.
Yes,
he has the...
Yeah, I have the mic, so
okay.
Thank you. I appreciate your passion and different facets of your argument. I think I want to...
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, you can hear the but coming. I take issue... Well, let me just clarify what you're saying, because I think one of your premises is that we don't teach, or maybe one of your arguments is that we don't teach enough about liberty, about freedom, about especially religious freedom and liberty. And I have the exact opposite opinion. Maybe it's because I'm Canadian and I've come here, I've been here for 3 years, but it seems that this culture and this society is vastly over-focused and fixated in a very narcissistic and individualistic way on freedom and liberty, and including religious orientation in that way. I don't know if you're familiar with William Kavanaugh, but he's written a book recently called Migrations of the Holy. And in it, he has a chapter on American exceptionalism and called Messianic Nation. But in it, he says, this is just a quote from it, Americans now essentially worship our freedom to worship God. And in that chapter, he spends quite a bit of time talking about this aspect of worshiping freedom and worshiping our liberty. And I fully engage with and agree with different aspects of what you're saying. But further, what Brian was saying earlier, my friend from Canada, is are there any dangers that we might have as political scientists or as people in general in focusing on too much on liberty and on freedom?
Nope. I'm black and white. No. I understand where you're coming from. Actually, I'm glad to hear what you just had to say, because again, that phrase I have all my political economy students ask, as compared to what? The fact that you're coming into this place, you're saying, whoa, you guys are talking way too much about liberty, makes me feel good, and less likely to move to Canada.
You should try it. It's not that bad.
I know, I got to be nice to Canadians. I love you guys. I do.
I love you too.
But I guess I don't know, what's this guy's name, Kavanaugh or something?
William Kavanaugh, yeah, he's a
Okay,
Catholic
you have him come
theologian.
talk to me.
Sure.
Well, I don't know what that means by we worship freedom too much. I don't know what that means. I love freedom. I want free. I understand that there's some dark sides and downsides to it, because I can't build, paradise here on earth. And as I tell my political economy students, there's trade-offs with everything, right? Bad's going to come with good. But what's the alternative to not worshiping freedom? I mean, what's he think? We should ignore freedom. We should not worship freedom. Freedom should just be something like a pizza. I don't know.
Freedom is an instrument as opposed to the goal.
Absolutely, freedom is an instrument.
Americans tend to emphasize freedom as almost the ultimate goal. Liberty as
I don't understand how.
Well, that's the way. Outside of this context, me as a Canadian coming and listening to you, I hear and empathize with what you're saying, but it seems to be, I think you're talking to a particularly interesting American context, and for me, outside of the country coming in, it's not ringing as true and as self-evident as I think you're trying to make it to be. But I mean, I appreciate it.
I'm not sure.
Thank you.
Who's the next person? Kimberly, did you have a question? Yeah. I'll give Kimberly the question because she's agreed to be on my podcast shortly, so if she gives me a hard one. Yeah. Okay, go ahead. No.
I'm Kim Conger from Colorado State, and this is along the same lines as the last couple of questions, but again, I'm not a political philosopher, so that should encourage you. Basically, it seems to me in a lot of the arguments that you make about the importance of liberty and how we think about it are really premised on a pretty radical individualism in certain terms of what I can do and the gifts that I have and the way God's created me. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective as a Christian, how do you think about that in terms of all of the instruction that Jesus and Paul and give us about giving up our own rights, about not submitting to authority but submitting to each other and looking out for others' interests before our own, and all of those kind of things in a real general sense, not necessarily. Those instructions aren't about politics; they're about life together as Christians. So I'm just curious about.
I think that's great. I don't see any contradiction. And Jesus says, give unto yourself. And I say, well, give me the freedom to give unto myself. Don't make me force somebody else to give unto somebody else because I think they're not giving unto somebody else. I mean, that's a. So
if we choose on our own to live in submissive community with one another, that's not the same thing as forcing somebody to do it.
You want to, form a commune and call it something that's going to eventually become a refrigerator? You go do that. A manna, by the way. Just okay. You're free to do that, right? You're free to do a lot of different things. There are good things and bad things, right? I'm free to live in, according to God's word. I'm also free to sin.
But doesn't emphasizing it this way make people look out for their own rights instead of other people's?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so at all. Because again, and this is one of those arguments that come up, that you say, oh, if you don't let the government do this, nobody will step up and volunteer. And I say, you don't know the people I hang with. And you don't know your own citizens and how much power that they can bring to a voluntary table. I mean, it really comes down to this. Do you really trust other people to do that good thing? That's always, oh no, if we don't get the government to do it, nobody's going to cooperate. Nobody's going to listen to what Jesus says, give unto others. It's up to us as Christian political scientists and as Christians, period, to make that case is that, yes, you have freedom, but you use that freedom to live according to God's word. And all the good parishioners said, amen. Amen.